The biting wind cut through James's thin jacket as he walked down the cracked sidewalk. His hands shoved deep into his pockets. His stomach growled, a familiar ache that never seemed to go away. It had been another long, exhausting day of job, hunting, another round of rejection emails piling up in his inbox. He had lost count of how many times he'd heard, "We're looking for someone with more experience." How was he supposed to gain experience when no one would give him a chance? He exhaled, watching his breath swirl into the cold evening air. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting an orange glow over the quiet street. Most people had already gone home, their warm living rooms illuminated through apartment windows. James had no home to go to, just a small, barely livable room in a rundown motel on the outskirts of town. Rent was due soon, and he was running out of options. As he trudged forward, his tired eyes caught sight of an elderly woman struggling with a heavy grocery bag on the corner of the street. She wore a long tattered coat and a wool hat that barely covered her silver hair. The bag in her hand looked like it was about to tear apart, its contents shifting dangerously with every shaky step she took. Pedestrians passed by, glancing at her but making no move to help. James hesitated. He barely had enough energy to stand upright himself, but something inside him wouldn't let him walk away. With a sigh, he quickened his pace and reached out. "Here, let me help you with that," he said gently. The woman looked up, startled, then studied his face. Her deep brown eyes, filled with age and wisdom, softened as she gave him a small nod. "Oh, thank you, dear. My hands just aren't what they used to be," she admitted, releasing the bag into his grip. James was surprised at how light it was. The way she had struggled, he expected it to be filled with bricks. He glanced down and noticed there weren't even that many groceries inside. Just a few canned goods, a loaf of bread, and a carton of milk. Hardly enough for a proper meal. "Where are you headed?" he asked, adjusting the bag. "Just a few blocks down," she replied. "It's not far, but my legs aren't as strong as they used to be." James nodded, walking beside her at a slow pace. The silence between them was oddly comfortable, filled only by the soft sounds of their footsteps on the pavement. He stole a glance at her face. She had the kind of presence that made you feel at ease, like a grandmother who had seen everything life had to offer and still chose kindness. As they neared an old apartment building, the woman let out a weary sigh. "This is me," she said, gesturing to the entrance. "I don't usually ask for help, but today's been a little rough." James smiled, handing her the bag. "No problem at all. I hope you have a good evening." The woman took the bag, but didn't move. Instead, she studied him again, as if searching for something unspoken in his expression. Then, after a pause, she said, "Young man, are you doing okay?" James forced a chuckle. "Yeah, just a little tired." She didn't look convinced. "You don't have to pretend with me. I've seen that look before." For a moment, James considered brushing it off. He had gotten used to keeping his struggles to himself, but there was something about her, something that made him want to be honest. "It's just been a tough time," he admitted finally. "Hard to find work. Hard to keep going some days." The woman nodded, as if she understood exactly what he meant. Then, to his surprise, she smiled. "You know, kindness has a way of coming back to you when you least expect it," she said softly. "Sometimes in ways you'd never imagine." James didn't know what to say to that. He simply nodded, offering her one last polite smile before turning to leave. But as he took his first step away, the woman called out, "Wait!" James turned back. "Would you be willing to come inside for a few minutes?" she asked. "I have something I want to give you." He hesitated. He barely knew this woman, and yet there was something about the way she said it, something in her voice that made it impossible to refuse. Curiosity flickered in his chest as he nodded. All right, as he followed her through the creaky door and up the dimly lit stairs. He had no idea that this small act of kindness was about to change his life forever. James followed the elderly woman up the narrow staircase, his footsteps echoing in the quiet hallway. The building smelled of old wood and faint traces of something warm, perhaps tea or spices lingering from a home-cooked meal. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper, peeling slightly at the edges, and the dim lighting cast long shadows on the worn-out carpet. Everything about this place felt frozen in time. The woman reached the door to her apartment and fumbled with her keys. Her hands trembled slightly as she turned the lock, and James noticed the deep wrinkles on her fingers. She must have been living alone for a long time. "Come in, dear," she said, pushing the door open. James stepped inside, expecting a cramped, cluttered space. But the apartment was neat, though small, filled with old-fashioned furniture and shelves lined with books. A single lamp cast a warm glow over the room, and a well-worn couch sat near the window. The place felt cozy, but there was something undeniably lonely about it. "Make yourself comfortable," she said, setting the grocery bag down on the kitchen counter. "I'll put the kettle on." James hesitated for a second before sitting on the couch. His body sank into the cushions, exhaustion weighing him down. He glanced around, taking in the small details. The black and white photos on the walls, the delicate porcelain figurines on a wooden shelf. "You live here alone?" he asked, his voice breaking the silence. The woman nodded as she filled a kettle with water. "I do. My husband passed away years ago, and we never had children. It's just me now." James felt a pang of sympathy. He knew what loneliness felt like. Different circumstances, but the same emptiness. The woman walked over and handed him a cup of tea. He wrapped his cold hands around it, letting the warmth seep into his skin. "I never got your name," James said, offering a small smile. She chuckled. "How rude of me. My name is Eleanor." "Nice to meet you, Eleanor. I'm James." She nodded knowingly. "James? A strong name." He took a sip of the tea, feeling it warm him from the inside out. For a moment, they sat in comfortable silence, but James couldn't shake the feeling that Eleanor had a reason for inviting him in. There was something in her eyes, something almost calculating, as if she was trying to make a decision. "You said you had something to give me," he finally asked, breaking the silence. Eleanor smiled softly. "Yes, but first tell me something, James. What do you want most in life?" The question caught him off guard. He had spent so much time surviving, barely making it from one day to the next, that he hadn't stopped to think about what he actually wanted. "I guess." He hesitated. "I just want a chance to prove myself, to have a stable life, a job I don't hate, maybe a place to call home." Eleanor nodded as if she expected that answer. She reached for a small wooden box on the coffee table, running her fingers over the lid before opening it. Inside was an old folded letter and a single key. "This belonged to my husband," she said, taking the letter out carefully. "Before he passed, he made me promise to find someone deserving of what he left behind." James frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" She handed him the letter. "Read it." James unfolded the paper, his hands slightly trembling, as he read the handwritten words. "To the one who proves that kindness still exists in this world." The letter spoke of gratitude, of giving to someone who had nothing but still chose to help others. It told a story of a man who built something great, but knew that wealth meant nothing if it wasn't shared with the right person. James's eyes darted back up to Eleanor. "What is this?" She smiled, placing the key in his hand. "This is the key to your new beginning." His heart pounded. I don't understand. Eleanor leaned back, studying him carefully. My husband owned several properties. He never trusted corporations or greedy investors, so he kept them under his name. After he passed, I held on to them, unsure of what to do. I've seen too many. People take advantage of wealth, but you helped me when you didn't have to. You didn't know who I was. You didn't expect anything in return. That's the kind of person my husband believed in. James shook his head, his mind racing. Are you saying? She nodded. I want you to have it. One of the properties. It's not just a house, James. It's an opportunity, a chance to build something for yourself. His hands tightened around the key. This had to be some kind of joke. Things like this didn't happen in real life, especially not to people like him. I can't accept this, he stammered. You don't even know me. Eleanor smiled knowingly. I know enough, and I know that if my husband were here, he would say the same thing I'm saying now. Kindness deserves to be rewarded. James's chest tightened. He had spent years feeling invisible, struggling just to get by. And now, in the most unexpected moment, his life was being handed a second chance. But could he trust it? Was this real? He stared at the key in his palm, the weight of it sinking in. His mind screamed at him to be cautious. But deep down, something told him that this was the moment he had been waiting for. Still, there was one thing left unanswered. Why me? He whispered. Eleanor's expression softened. Because I see something in you, James. And I have a feeling you're going to prove me right. His breath caught in his throat. For the first time in a long time, hope flickered in his chest. But with hope came fear. Because second chances were rare. And the thought of losing this opportunity was almost too much to bear. James clenched the key in his fist, realizing that whatever happened next, it was going to change everything. James stared at the key in his palm, the weight of it heavier than anything he had ever held. His mind raced with questions. Was this real? Could he trust it? He had spent years struggling, watching opportunities slip through his fingers, and now, a woman he had just met was offering him something most people could only dream of. A fresh start. His heart pounded as he looked up at Eleanor, searching for any sign that this was some kind of test, a trick, a mistake. But all he saw was kindness, a quiet certainty in her expression, as if she had already made up her mind. I don't know what to say, James admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Then don't say anything, Eleanor replied gently. Just accept it. The room felt impossibly still. He wanted to believe this was real, that it wasn't just another fleeting hope that would be taken away. Finally, he exhaled. Okay. Eleanor's face lit up with a warmth that made the small apartment feel like home. Good. Then let's go see it. The words sent a jolt through James. Right now. Why not? She said with a playful smile. No sense in waiting. A part of him still hesitated, but something about Eleanor made it impossible to refuse. He followed her back outside, where the air was crisp, the city quiet, except for the occasional passing car. They walked together to the curb, where a modest but well-kept car was parked. Eleanor climbed in with surprising ease for her age, and James hesitated only for a moment before getting in beside her. The drive was quiet at first, the hum of the engine filling the space between them. Then Eleanor spoke, her voice soft but steady. My husband built his fortune from nothing, she said. He knew what it was like to struggle, to feel like the world had already decided your fate. That's why he always believed in giving people a real chance. James nodded, watching the city lights blur past the window. Sounds like he was a good man. The best, she said, a hint of sadness in her smile. And I see a lot of him in you. The word struck something deep inside James. Something he wasn't sure he was ready to face. He had spent so long feeling invisible, as if the world had already given up on him. But here was a woman who saw him, really saw him, and for the first time in a long time, he let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, things were about to change. When they finally pulled up in front of the property, James felt his breath catch in his throat. It wasn't a mansion, not some grand estate like he had imagined in the back of his mind. Instead, it was a modest but beautiful house, sitting on a quiet street lined with trees, the kind of house people built lives in, a place that felt like it had stories to tell. Eleanor turned to him, eyes twinkling. "It's yours, James." He stepped out of the car, his legs unsteady as he approached the front door. The key in his hand suddenly felt impossibly significant. He slid it into the lock, heart pounding, and turned it. The door creaked open, revealing a space that was simple but warm, as if it had been waiting for him. Wooden floors, a small but inviting living room, a kitchen that smelled faintly of the past. It wasn't just a house, it was a home. James swallowed hard, emotions threatening to overwhelm him. He had spent so long fighting to survive, never daring to dream of something like this. He turned to Eleanor, his voice thick with emotion. "Why me?" She smiled, stepping inside beside him. "Because you reminded me that good people still exist. And sometimes, good people just need a little help." James looked around, letting the moment settle in. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had one. He turned back to Eleanor, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Thank you," he said, and he meant it more than he had ever meant anything in his life. Eleanor patted his arm, her own eyes shining. "Just promise me one thing." "Anything," James said without hesitation. She nodded. "Someday, when you see someone struggling, someone who needs a hand, remember this moment and pass it on." James took a deep breath, letting her words sink in. He thought about all the times he had felt hopeless, all the times he had wished for someone to just see him, to give him a chance. And now, standing in a house that was his, because of a simple act of kindness, he knew he would never forget. Someday, he would pay it forward, and that, he realized, was the real gift Eleanor had given him.